Hey students, um, this is your second lecture on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I apologize for not doing one last week, but it seemed to make sense to me. This is the first time I've done these lectures to kind of combine what I wanted to say in the lecture last week with what I'm going to say to you today on Monday when I'm recording this. And a lot of it will have to do with just some themes from the reading that I think are important and that I think are interesting. Most of the things you probably noticed as potentially interesting issues, things that were going on in the book that I just want to say a little more about. And then I'll talk a little bit about what happens in the last section of the reading that we had up through Monday. And then you will have your discussion questions due on Friday. You have the time off for the brief break that we have, and then those discussion questions will be due. And I think that you'll find what I'm going to be providing you with today, in addition to what I did in my first lecture, that will be helpful as far as that goes. So I know I've talked previously quite a bit about romanticism, about the emphasis in romanticism on nature, on the idea that everything is kind of good as it comes to us from nature, and that human corruption comes from the sin of human beings. It's not always clear how that's introduced into the world. Typically, it has something to do with society, but certainly societies stem from nature too, as human beings do. So it's a little mysterious, but nonetheless, that's definitely a major theme in the book, and we can definitely see it in the Frankenstein's monster, right? In the daemon himself, in terms of the way he talks about what his experience was like as he was kind of burst into the world and trying to learn his way, make his way, and kind of figure out how to take care of himself, how to get food, shelter, those kinds of things. So that theme of nature. And you see it in particular with Victor when he talks about wanting rejuvenation, that was something that he always did, right? He would go to nature. He would go hiking in the mountains. He would go for a ride on the lake, or just maybe go out in a rowboat on the lake and kind of lie there. He would do it in nighttime as well as the daytime. But that has taken on a more gothic aspect now, that the monster's out there somewhere. And that as we come to understand, the monster is dangerous. The monster is angry at Victor, and then angry at all human beings for the way he's being treated. He's done his best to be kind and thoughtful and helpful, and every time he does, people throw things at him, try to kill him, yell at him, whatever it might be, reject him in one way or another. And that has made him more angry and more frustrated, most pointedly at Victor, but also, I think, with other human beings in general. One sort of interesting instance of this theme of sort of going to nature is referenced in relationship to Clairville, right? Victor's close friend who did not go with him originally to Ingolstadt because his father wanted him to focus on a more practical training for an occupation that was going to provide him with enough money to raise a family and put food on the table and to buy a home and those kind of things. But he does eventually come to visit Victor, as we understand. He is there shortly after Victor had created the monster, and the monster has left, we found out, and Victor's just kind of wandering around. He instantly, as soon as the monster comes to life, he recognizes his mistake, that he hadn't thought about the consequences of what he was doing. And he says that he really did have the best intentions, and creating and kind of bringing back to life dead flesh and making it live again, that could be a great benefit to humanity in terms of saving people's lives, or and now we understand that you can actually, replace people's organs. This was something that you can imagine Victor dreaming about being able to do. But then things just got out of hand, right? He wanted to create this whole being. You get a sense that he wants to prove everybody wrong, maybe in particular his father, who was initially very much rejected Victor's interests in alchemy and this outdated science, when Victor was younger, but his father never redirected that interest and that energy towards something more positive, just sort of told him that he was a fool and he was wasting his time. His first professor at Ingolstadt did the same thing, Professor Kremp. So that I think that sort of motivated him to try and prove everybody wrong. And one of the things that is a part of that that's important is that he detaches himself from all of his family and friends. He's obsessed with what he's doing. He doesn't want people to know about it or find out about it. You get the sense that he wants to wait until he is successful in creating this being before he contacts again his friends and family, so he can say, I told you so that I could do this. But as soon as the monster comes to life, he realizes that he made a mistake, and he sees the monster as evil instantly, which I think is really important. The yellow eyes of the monster. Remember, I mentioned previously that yellow kind of stands for illness or evil symbolically throughout the book. The yellow moon, for example, when it appears in the sky, kind of betokens the fact or foreshadows the fact that the monster will soon appear. So that, the look on his monster's face, the huge proportions of the monster, once that flesh comes to life, especially the face, instantly he sees malevolence in the monster, which is ironic, right? Because the monster, we find out, is not malevolent at first. He very much is, along with, following with this idea of romanticism, again, that everything from nature is good and virtuous, etc. He is that way at the very beginning. And it's the rejection that he confronts and the violence that he confronts against him that seems to make him turn evil. So at first, he's almost like this Adam creature, right? That if we imagine Victor playing God and creating the monster, that the monster is his Adam that he does not take care of and nurture. And because of that, that Adam turns evil. He does horrible things, in particular, the murders that he commits. So we get this kind of combination of this more traditional romanticism with this real Gothic element of romanticism, this Gothic offshoot of romanticism. One really interesting instance of the romanticism is Victor's discussions of Clairville after he meets Clairville and they go traveling again together. We know that Victor had agreed to make this bride of Frankenstein's monster, and he needs to go away from his home to do that and just get away from everybody. And Clairville really wants to go with him. And he says, he's happy to have Clairville with him for a time being, but that he needs to be by himself when he actually creates this monster, right? So he goes to this remote location in this old beat up cottage that he repairs enough that he can live in it. It has 2 rooms, one's for him to live in, the other's for him to create this bride for the monster. He must have found a place to get body parts, a cemetery somewhere. He doesn't tell us specifically about this, but that's what he did in making the first monster. And a little later in the story, after things really start to turn bad, when he just decides not to make this bride for the monster, and the monster, it gets very angry at him. He kind of howls at him and screams and gets back in his boat and crosses the water again to go back to the mainland. And Victor starts talking as though he's talking the past tense about Clairville and how much he misses Clairville and remembers him. That foreshadows that something really bad is going to happen to Clairville, which is not surprising, right? Because the monster says that I'm going to do evil things to all of your family and friends to make your life miserable. You're taking away the opportunity for me to have someone to care for me, this bride. And he says, that they will go off and live in South America somewhere and away from people and won't be any danger to people, because that's all he would have in his life. He's lonely. So after Victor destroys this female companion he's going to be making for the monster. It sounds like he's pretty much almost finished at that point. That the monster says, I'm going to make you as lonely as you've made me. So it's not surprising that something's going to happen to Clairville, but there's very strong foreshadowing that that's the case. But at one point when he's talking about Clairville and how much he sort of thinking back about Clairville, he talks about how Clairville also really appreciated nature. And in the Penguin edition of Frankenstein, and I know that some of the editions number the chapters consecutively. Some break it into separate books, and that may have been a little confusing. If you have an edition that breaks it into separate books, just go ahead and think about the chapters as numbered just numerically from 1 to the final chapter, and you'll be able to find your place if you do have the edition that breaks into several books and can't find your way, just based on the syllabus numbers. But in the third chapter of Volume 2, I believe it's the third chapter of Volume 2. I'm actually being a little later than that. Let me find exactly where it's in fact chapter 1, so it must be chapter 1 of Volume 3. And he's thinking about Clairville. He actually cites something from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, one of his most famous poems. Like Victor, and it seems like Clairville as well, and this is an important theme of Romanticism, Wordsworth would kind of go back to nature when he wanted to rejuvenate and refresh himself, when he wanted to try and see the world kind of through a child's eyes, as if he's seeing it for the first time. One of the ways he does that is sometimes go back and return to these places with a friend or a family member, typically it's his sister, and to talk about their experiences as children and seeing some of these places, these old castles, in this case, Tintern Abbey. And he mentions that Clairville really enjoyed this himself, kind of going back to it. The sounding cataract haunted him like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to him an appetite, a feeling, and a love that had no need of remoter charm, by thought supplied or any interest unborrowed from the eye. That comes from Tintern Abbey from Wordsworth. So this is not just something that's a theme for Victor. I think Mary Shelley is showing us that this theme of Romanticism is a theme, more broadly in the book, and that it's something that's also tied specifically with the monster. And again, the way we learn the monster is actually was not malevolent when he was born. And I just wanted to share with you real briefly here a picture. There are quite a number of them. It's actually a photograph of Tintern Abbey. I don't know exactly what it looked like in Wordsworth's time. It may have been a little better shape than it is here. But in these places, obviously, everything that is not going to survive over time has been destroyed, any of the woodwork, etc. But that's Tintern Abbey. It's still a place that people often go, tourists often go, or because they know Wordsworth's poem and because it was an important place historically. This is Tintern Abbey that Clairville used to go to and really enjoy as a place to kind of rejuvenate himself, just like Victor would go into the mountains or to a lake somewhere to rejuvenate himself. I mentioned previously this idea that the monster is sort of the Adam to Victor's God, and we talked about the fact that Victor is kind of playing God. Again, that's why the subtitle of Frankenstein is A Modern Prometheus, because Prometheus also was, in a sense, playing God by stealing fire from the gods and giving it to mortal human beings, something he shouldn't have done. Was it not kind of an act of playing God, just as Frankenstein has done? Though, just the way Prometheus gave fire to human beings and kind of loosed it on the world to be used for whatever purposes it might be used, Victor created this monster and loosed it on the world to do whatever it was going to do. And it's sort of amazing. He tries to forget about the monster. and pretend he doesn't exist. And the way Mary Shelley sometimes writes about it, it seems like Victor is forgetting about the monster a little more easily than one might imagine him being able to do. Not being as worried about coming across the monster until he actually does face to face in the mountains, where the monster tells him his story, etc. And after he realizes the monster has been responsible for the death of his younger brother William, that we really see him starting to worry about seeing the monster around every corner somewhere. But it seems like he is just hoping that he can kind of forget about the monster will go away and either just perish, not be able to survive, or that somebody will have killed it because of the way it looks, its evil appearance, or that it will just go and live in some remote, part of the world. But he seems to be able to forget about, or try to forget about him until all these events start happening where he sees consequences of the monster, like the death of his younger brother William and Justine, a member of his family who was adopted into the family, kind of took care of the family, who is blamed for the murder because the monster very cleverly sort of set him up. And he blames human beings for this, that he wouldn't have he wouldn't have killed William, probably, at least he suggests, or tried to frame Justine for the murder if he hadn't been reading these books about human beings and their histories. And he takes these, even these fictional books, like the Goethe's text on Werther, and he read it as though it was a true story. So he reads fiction as it was true story, and he read the lives, famous lives of famous people, etc. So he learned that human beings can do kind of nasty things sometimes, and that he learned that from these books, and therefore decided, as another form of malevolence, to take this piece of jewelry that Elizabeth had given to William, and plant it on Justine after he kills William, so that Justine is eventually blamed for the murder. But it's the same appeal, that sort of idea that, the monster says to Victor, you're responsible for me like I'm your son, right? You're the God, or you're God, and I'm Adam. We remember Victor's feeling of rejection from his father when he criticizes him for reading alchemy. So he's sensitive to that kind of an argument. He too is a kind of a loner. He has felt rejection. And I think that's what enables him to listen to the monster story and to really be sympathetic to it, and maybe to start taking care of him as a parent would, until the monster starts talking about his anger as it develops and killing William, framing Justine. Then he has a very difficult time feeling empathetic about the monster after these murders happen. We also, again, are in a situation where we don't know what Robert Walton is thinking about all these things that he's hearing Victor tell him, right? Because he's still telling him his story from the ship after Walton and his shipmates have pulled Victor out of the water as he was chasing the monster. And at the end of the book, we'll kind of get back to that chase scene again. We don't know what Robert Walton is thinking about all of this. And there's another interesting parallel to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner in this, because the mariner, when he's telling people his story, when he's confessing, it's as though the people he's telling the story to are mesmerized by his story and they can't turn away from it. It's the wedding guest, as this person is named, because he doesn't really know who this person is. He just goes up to somebody who he just knows needs to hear his story. Maybe they're likely to make a similar mistake and sin against God in the same way that the mariner did. That he feels like he has to tell this person his story. He can just tell, even though he doesn't know this person's name. And that we get a sense that Robert Walton perhaps is mesmerized in the same way that the wedding guest was mesmerized in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and is just sort of standing there, hearing the story that he later writes down and sends off to his sister. But it creates an aporia. It's a term sometimes used in literary criticism in the arts. It's kind of an empty space. of possibility. We don't know what to fill that space in with. And the aporia in this case is not knowing how Robert Walton is receiving what he's hearing from Victor. We know he's probably somewhat sympathetic because they're very similar. And Mary Shelley does a great job of showing very early in the book that this Robert Walton character is very similar to Victor. He feels isolated. He wants to do great things, things that maybe are leading him to try and act like God, do things against nature that he shouldn't be doing. Victor has endangered the world by creating this monster. Robert Walton has endangered his shipmates by taking the ship and trying to sail to all the way to the North Pole, just as the Mariner had endangered his crew. So we don't know. We know he's probably somewhat sympathetic to Victor, but you have to wonder sometimes what kind of what is he making faces? What is he thinking while he's being told this story? Does he believe it all? Victor is very compelling. It sounds like in the way he told the story, that we get the sense that that Robert Walton is probably believing what he's hearing, but we don't know. But I think at least worth remembering that and thinking about that fact, not forgetting that what we're reading is the Robert Walton retelling what he heard from Victor to this written account that he is providing and seemingly sending off to his sister Margaret. Notice too, at this stage in the book, and this even gets more frequent, Victor is continuing to waffle over whether he's responsible for what he did. He keeps basically saying that maybe he took one step in the wrong direction and then it was just out of his hands. That one step that he took in the wrong direction, he was fated to take, and after that, events are just spinning out of control. This is very similar, again, to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, when as soon as the mariner crosses over once he starts heading south below the equator, that nature takes over and things start happening. At first, the wind stops and he's stuck with his crew. They can't get anywhere. They can't drink the water because it's salt water. They run out of food. They're all getting ill. Finally, the wind picks up again and they start moving. And it seems like the albatross is responsible for this. Then he kills the albatross and the ship stops moving again. And all these horrible things sort of happen. But there was that first step, and we don't know why he took that first step of crossing over the equator the way he did. There was no reason for going in that direction that we know about. But it seems like after that, the mariner also wants to say that events spun out of control. And in some sense, it was nature that kind of took over. And we get the same sort of idea here from Victor. That he took that first step. And even that first step may have been reading about alchemy and then having his father reject him. There's several different things that he points to. Seeing lightning destroy this tree and realizing that lightning can both and electricity can both create and destroy, all these different events. And as one horrible thing starts to happen in succession after another, and as those things are closer and closer to each other, he is more obsessed with telling Robert Walton, and therefore we read about it, that it's all fate. And that he just, again, events spun out of his control. These horrible things are happening. He can't stop them. He can't actually tell anybody or warn anybody at the monster because they won't believe him. Right? He couldn't tell people that there's no way Justine could have killed William, and that he knows that actually the monster was responsible for killing William and not Justine, but nobody's going to believe him when he tries to tell his story. And he won't even, at first he doesn't even try to tell the story about what happened. I mean, later he does, but because he knows people won't believe that he tried to create this monster. And he becomes more and more obsessed with the fact that it's fate that has taken over and things are out of his control. We do see, as I mentioned, in this very romantic sort of notion that the monster really has a childlike appreciation for all of everything that he sees and experiences. He has to learn about things, about hot and cold, about fire and water, and that he needs to feed himself, and that fire is hot and will burn him, all these kind of things. And he actually has a more difficult time with that because he has the strength and the power of an adult. Right? Children, when they come into the world, human beings are helpless. The parents know how to take care of the child and how to keep the child out of danger. The monster doesn't know this. He has this childlike sort of lack of experience and lack of knowledge, but he is often himself. He's isolated. He's lonely. He has the strength of a human being. He has the brain of a human being, a full grown human being. And he has to learn in a very different way, in a very unique way, how to be a human being, how to survive, how to make his way in the world, kind of starting from a blank slate, a tabula rasa, as it's called. But that everything he experiences is new to him. There are a lot of wonderful things that he experiences, that he's not malevolent, even though Victor saw him that way as soon as he came to life. And that he is consistent with this, again, this theme of romanticism. There's another interesting theme here that one has to think, given who Mary Shelley was, and given that her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, and that she read her mother's writings and was associated with liberalism through her father, William Godwin, and the people he associated with, and this journal that he published, etc. That there's an absence of women in the story, in part because they have been put at arm's length in some sense by the men in the story, right? The men in the story are in some sense the ones that are actually taking these actions. There's Robert Walton, there's Victor, and there's the monster as the three main characters. And then again, we also have, if you want to, think about the role that Rime Ancient Mariner played here, there's also the mariner on his ship. There's no female companionship, no mother, sister, whatever else on that ship. And it may be suggested here that because with romanticism, as morality is more and more identified with affect, with sentiment, with empathy, and all the things I talked about in my first lecture, that are identified with femininity, that there's an absence of these female characters in the story in terms of being there to talk to console, to direct, to nurture, to be that moral compass for the male characters. That I think that absence of female characters is important here. And that maybe indirectly Mary Shelley is trying to say something about, by that absence of female characters. Victor won't even write to Elizabeth when he's creating the monster. We find that he wants to marry Elizabeth, eventually. But just as he puts his family off to the side and will not write to them while he's away at Ingolstadt, that puts Elizabeth as a potential moral compass, out of the picture. The same thing for Robert Walton. He writes to his sister, but she can't write back. She can't try and say, please don't try and undertake this trip. You're going to kill yourself. You're going to kill your crew. There's no way you can make it to the North Pole. The monster doesn't have a mother, only has a father, and that father leaves him isolated. So you have to think that that's an important theme here, maybe kind of important sub-theme here. It's also sort of interesting, if you think about this theme, that Victor could write to Elizabeth if he wanted and chooses not to. It would have been very easy for him. On the other hand, Robert Walton is writing these letters to his sister, Margaret, when probably it's very doubtful that they're going to actually make their way to her. And we never really know if that's the case or not. Kind of a spoiler alert here. We never really know. but it's likely that, especially after the first couple letters are before he gets on ship and starts sailing away, right? It's the ones after he begins the trip and he becomes farther and farther isolated and closer to the North Pole, and they're having to make their way through all of this ice, and things get worse, and he's more and more endangering his crew, and it's more likely they'll get caught in the ice and just perish. That's the phase when he's actually writing this story. So he must wonder again if anybody is ever going to read this story. These wonderful, fascinating, disturbing, very gothic kinds of things that he's hearing Victor tell him. But he's still writing home to his sister. He will probably never get to read what he has written. But he's still doing it. He's still telling his story. In a way, it may be his own indirect confession. This will become more of a theme in the last section of reading. So pay attention to that, the extent to which Victor influences Robert Walton's own choices and what he's going to be doing with his trip. Another example of a female character that I think is interesting and important here, that no doubt is been kind of placed in the story intentionally, is this character named Safi, who we find out is this love interest of the DeLacy family, Felix DeLacy in particular, right? We meet the father who is blind, who the monster tries to introduce himself to get to know, because he's blind and he thinks he's not going to be prejudiced against him because he can't see how ugly he is, and that once he gains his trust, that the family will take care of him. But he panics when he hears Felix and his sister coming back to the house, and he starts acting sort of irrationally, and he is this big ugly monster character. So Felix starts beating him and chasing him away, and this is sort of when he realizes that was the final straw for him of actually trying to be kind to people. But we find out that Felix had this love interest named Safi, who is this woman from Turkey, and Felix has actually helped his father get out of prison and wants to marry Safi, and his father says, okay, you can marry her. She's really wealthy, a very wealthy family. Later on, the father says, there's no way I'm going to let you marry Safi. You're just an old peasant. And she's this regal-born, wealthy woman. And this is when Felix and his sister and, Mr. DeLacy go off and live in the woods in great poverty by themselves. But eventually, Safi gets away on her own and makes her way to the cottage. And the monster is figuring out this whole story of Safi and where she came from, which is, I think, tells him another, he's learning more about human beings and what they're like, the good and the bad, from what he's witnessing. But the Safi character is interesting. She feels oppressed by in living in Turkey. And there's definitely a theme here that Mary Shelley is bringing into the story of what Mary Shelley obviously views as oppression by the Islamic society against women and against the church against women. And this is why the Safi character supposedly, can't live in Turkey anymore, won't live in Turkey anymore. She was living in England, but she's not, she can't return to Turkey with her father, who wants her to return. So she runs off, eventually finds Felix. Safi is very close to the Greek word Sophia, which means wisdom. Although in the original Turkish, it means pure, but similar. No matter how you want to associate the name with purity or with Sophia, again, the Greek word for wisdom, people have suggested that Safi is kind of modeled in a way after Mary Wollstonecraft, after Mary Shelley's mother. And, as being, as rejecting the oppression that she had been experiencing, and as having her own kind of of independence. She turns away from the great wealth that she was going to inherit to find her true love, Felix. And I found this slide sort of interesting. The partially passive woman. So here's Safi is being presented here as not totally, radical and really progressive. On the other hand, she's not totally passive to her situation either. She's willing to take her situation into her own hands and leave her father, travel to find Felix and his family to live with them. So as the slide says, Safi came from Turkey to England with her father. She fell in love with Felix. Her father wanted Safi to go back with him to Turkey. She refuses to do so because she falls for Felix. And it's not just that. Again, I think it's important to recognize that there's this oppression she's feeling living in Turkey, an oppression not just against her, but against women in general. You can imagine Mary Wollstonecraft would have also been critical of. So she's not totally passive because she tells her father what she really wants and eventually ends up leaving. I think that there should have been a reference here to this aspect of being oppressed by Turkish society and by Islam, et cetera, that Mary Shelley is suggesting here. That's also a part of the story. But I had mentioned that Professor Waldman, who's the professor that Victor does get along with, who actually helps him and nurtures his interest in science, is maybe modeled after William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, that perhaps Safi is modeled after her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. So I just wanted to share that. We're led to wonder, I think, interestingly, if the monster's killing of William was by accident or not. I think there's a real similar parallel here between the monster's actions, the actions of Victor, the actions of perhaps Robert Walton, certainly the actions of the mariner, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as having done something wrong, made a mistake, creating the monster, sailing below the equator, wanting to undertake a journey to the North Pole, Victor, wanting to help society with his science and then creating this monster, that then just events get out of control, right? So you make one mistake, yeah, it's a big mistake, but you end up paying the rest of your life for it, and other people end up paying for it too in terms of their loss of life. And we see that too in the monster's killing of William. He's trying to silence him, and he starts holding his neck. He doesn't understand his own strength necessarily, or the frailty of William, and he's hurting him, right? He's cutting off his breath. He can't breathe. He's choking him to death. And he starts to realize this, and it's as though he's going to stop doing it, but he realizes that it's Victor's brother. And from what the William is screaming, and then he just pushes harder and then kills William intentionally. But at first, there was this sort of element to it that it was somewhat accidental. It was a mistake, but he could have not killed him. He could have stopped what he was doing, but he kind of reached a point of no return. And you get that point of no return idea is, I think, a really helpful maybe analogy for what's going on here with all of these things, with the mariner going below the equator, with Victor creating the monster, Robert Walton traveling north and getting to the point where they become caught in the ice and can't go back anymore, the monster and his choking of William. They get to the point where they can't turn back, and because they've gone too far, and they either won't stop or can't stop what they're doing, and things are out of their control. And that happens to the monster just like it happens to William, to Victor, Robert Walton, the mariner, right? All these different people in the story. So there are all these parallels here. But I think if you keep in your mind this idea of the point of no return, and once you pass that point, fate takes over and things are out of your control, that's a really important theme in the book here, I think, to keep in mind. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question and the issue of modernism, because I do think it's also important here. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Here's a slide that provides somewhat of a kind of an explanation here. There's a theme in the book that I've discussed previously in terms of the Enlightenment and the way the Enlightenment was replacing reason, rationality, logic, science with the authority of the church and the authority of tradition, or at least it was challenging those forms of authority. Tradition and religion didn't just give you a vision for what the world is like, what the nature of humanity is. It also gave you a sense for right and wrong and morality and ethics, how you should live your life as a human being. What's moral, what's not, what's ethical, what's not, what's virtuous and what's not. Once the authority of the church and of tradition start to weaken, and again, it depends on geography, it depends on the form of authority in various countries, nations, how progressive, how much their feudal system has progressed beyond that point to creating constitutional democracies or regular democracies or whatever. But nonetheless, as the authority of the church and tradition starts to waver, you lose that idea, you lose that sense of right and wrong, morality, ethics, virtue, because science that replaces it can tell you about human nature, the nature of the universe. It can give you an alternate explanation, but it cannot provide you with, many have argued, a sense of right and wrong, morality, ethics, and virtue, right? It tells you how things are. It doesn't tell you how things should be. Whereas the church and the authority of tradition did tell you those things. Now, there are people that used science, especially as we get into the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the social sciences developing, this idea that we can use science and scientific study, scientific experiment, scientific research to tell us, what is helpful and not what is not helpful. Utilitarianism, I know I talked about telling you, difference between right and wrong based on trying to maximize happiness, minimize pain, the calculation that it actually came up with for that, cost benefit analysis, those things. But in general, there's the idea again that science can only tell you the how of things, the way things are, but not how they should be. And in philosophy, there's something called the naturalistic fallacy, where you try to move from nature and the way things are to prescriptions about the way things should be. But that becomes really important here because along from that, it's been argued, is along with that becomes the estrangement of human beings from their creator, as again, the authority of the church starts to wane. And you don't see a lot, Victor doesn't seem to be a deeply religious person. He might talk a little bit about the church and about, God, and, now and again, but he doesn't seem to have religion as a moral compass for him. He doesn't seem to worry about how God is going to take retribution on him, how he will be punished by God for what he does. Everything is more in the context of romanticism and this idea that fate is going to take over and that it's human beings that are responsible for killing each other in the story that we're learning here. So you don't really get him the sense of him being a deeply religious person. Maybe if he was, he wouldn't have done what he did in the first place and tried to create this living being. Certainly that's very likely the case. So what I wanted to show you here with this little table here, modernism, and postmodernism. This is just a kind of a quick and dirty overview of the difference between the three that I thought you might find helpful historically. So pre-modern, we have realism and supernaturalism, right? That's the authority of the church. And as a explanation for the way things are. So it says, what is real here? Metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. So there is a reality, and we learn about it because ultimately the higher reality is the reality of the divine. And even in Plato's, there's the idea of an ideal reality, an ideal world. Modernism sort of starts to replace that with science. And so there is a reality, but it's a naturalistic reality that we learn about from science. So science provides a kind of a naturalism to replace the supernaturalism of pre-modernism. Postmodernism brings with us an anti-realism, with this idea that we can't know what the nature of reality is really like as human beings. It's beyond us to comprehend and to understand. We're all limited by where we exist, when we exist, our own culture, language, all these cultural elements. They provide us with a way to understand the world, but they don't provide us with a completely undistorted lens for kind of viewing the way things are. So that's when you get to that anti-realism. And it's really reflected, a lot of the postmodern ideas you'll see really reflected in the arts. How do I know things? Epistemology. What is it to know something? What is knowledge? So you have mysticism and or faith with pre-modernism. You can see how that ties in with the authority of religion and tradition and mythical realities. Modernism gives you the objectivism of science, experience, and reason that we talked about, empiricism. Postmodernism gives you a little more social subjectivism, the idea that of a kind of relativism, right? That it's your society or you as an individual who you kind of learn about the world, but that there's that sort of relativism, that you are a creature of your society. That rather than creating the world for yourself, it's your society that you learn from in terms of what is it to know things, what counts as knowledge, what counts as truth. And that ultimately is going to have that kind of a subjective element to it. Then there is human nature. Who am I? What am I? I'm original sin, subject to God's will. That's what you see, right, in terms of Christianity. Then you have that dualism too of the two realities, the earthly world versus a kind of heavenly realm. And you see that also in Plato's sort of ontology. Modernism with learning, you have that tabula rasa, right? Nature, science, we come into the world, we learn about things. There's an emphasis on individuality and autonomy, liberal philosophy, right? That we talked about in terms of the U.S. history documents with the United States, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, etc. Postmodernism gives you a more this idea that things are determined by society and people are shaped by society. That rather than this idea that you can shape and create yourself, that the more powerful force than that is the force of society on you. There's an emphasis on group conflict because of differences in beliefs and values, right? Then we get to who should I live? How should I live with ethics? There's a kind of an altruistic collectivism you see in pre-modern societies, agrarian societies, for example, right? Then there's very much the individualism I just mentioned with modernism. Then you get into a new forms of collectivism, new forms of egalitarianism with postmodernism, appreciating, accommodating other belief systems, other sets of values and beliefs, trying to be equitable to different people, right? And there's a kind of a collectivism that has kind of emerged out of that. How should we live? Politics and economics. Feudalism with pre-modern society. Liberal capitalism as it grows out of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment beliefs in the 17th and 18th centuries. Then you see more postmodernism. When postmodernism, you see more socialism. That really starts to develop in this country in particular in the early 20th century until the mid 20th century. Socialism and communism were relatively popular in this country. The parties, the socialist and communist parties were actually relatively large. They actually were able to elect people into office more at the local level than beyond that. But this idea that the world's getting really complicated, we need to take care of each other. Think about Social Security, think about the Depression in the early 20th century, the increase in the size of government and social programs and those sorts of things, the healthcare that we have today, right? Obamacare, as it was called, government-sponsored healthcare, which has actually been growing more popular, not less popular. Then there's one in where, again, these are the eras. So medieval era with pre-modernism, modernism, the Enlightenment, as I mentioned, current sciences, business in the technical fields. They didn't really talk about ethics here in terms of utilitarianism, but that's a part of this. And when you get into business and technical fields, you get into cost-benefit analysis and those ways of making decisions. Postmodernism, the current humanities and related professions, you really, again, see postmodernism a lot in the humanities and the arts. One of the main themes of postmodernism is this idea that if there's not one correct way to do things or one correct way to tell the story of the development of societies or any correct way in which societies should try and develop, that you get a kind of eclecticism that grows out of that. And you can really, again, see it in architecture. I know I've talked about that before with the Harold Washington and Library in Chicago that combines classical architecture with Gothic architecture. You see postmodernism in the bringing together different cultural perspectives on things and music and painting in the arts, new forms of arts that have developed, new forms of literature, of film that don't follow a particular singular narrative anymore, but they're kind of a pastiche or that move back and forth from one time and place to another. Breaking down the wall in theater and film where you actually are engaging directly with the audience. You actually acknowledge that there's an audience watching the play or watching the film. All these things are very sort of postmodern. And I found this sort of funny slide that kind of characterized that in a way. Here, I'll share that with you briefly. Again, I thought it was sort of kind of entertaining here. So, oops, excuse me. Let me go back again. Pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. So pre-modern because God put it there, and that's always been the way it's been. Modernism, these are kind of, again, cartoonish renderings. Modernism, onwards and upwards with inevitable progress, science, the Enlightenment, idealism, utopianism that grew out of it, all the different forms of that. They were eventually, again, crushed into the kind of dystopianism. And then postmodernism, and you can see there's not even a sentence there, a word that you can read. It's this idea of this chaos of language and culture, a new kind of Babel. You see the drawing there of just scribbles as identifying, postmodernism. But there are a lot of new possibilities that have grown out of postmodernism too, that again, you can really see in the arts and humanities and literature and film, in painting and new forms of arts, and arts that combine different disciplines. And in theater, this is something I've been actually writing about a lot recently with new forms of theater, what were called happenings in theater, new forms of creativity, because you got rid of that singular narrative that things must go in one direction based on certain kinds of formal principles. So you see that in modernism. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting visual representation of the differences here that were described in the previous slide. At the very end of what we had read for today, we know that, again, Victor had destroyed this monster he had been creating, that this monster bride, that the monster saw this, that he said, I'll be with you on your wedding night. Think about what that means. Who or what is in danger? What does this threat really mean from the monster? This question of whether or not Victor should have continued to make this monster bride. He convinced himself not to do it. After the monster had convinced him to do it, the monster said, I wasn't born evil. It was human beings that made me this way. If I have this companion, I won't be angry anymore. I won't, strike out against human beings anymore. My monster bride and I will go live in peace in South America. We'll live on berries and acorns. It's hard to know how a being that big could live on berries and acorns. But nonetheless, this is somewhat convincing to Victor. But then as he starts to become skeptical of creating this bride, he starts to say, What if he doesn't like the bride? What if the woman he creates doesn't like him? What if they reject each other because they're both ugly? What if she convinces him not to live in South America? What if the two of them end up being loosed on the world or unleashed and end up, killing more people? So he convinces himself not to make this female companion, destroys it. So we're supposed to think, I think, was that the right decision? Was it trying to create one evil by doing another one? And certainly you could say that from a traditional perspective on morality and ethics, right? That two bads don't make a right. Or you could say that it would have been a way for him to have done a good thing that in a sense will neutralize the problem that he had created in unleashing the monster on the world and rejecting the monster. So there are different ways of kind of thinking about this from a moral or ethical perspective. There have been, just like there were films on Frankenstein and the monster of Frankenstein, as some of you might already know, there are these famous films on the Bride of Frankenstein. Here's one advertisement. Bela Lugosi is very famous for these. And it's more horrifying than Dracula and Frankenstein is the Bride of the Monster of Frankenstein. This obviously looks nothing like this Bride of the Monster. It obviously changes the story significantly, right? Where the monster is going to fall in love with the bride. The bride's not going to really want to be with the monster in this retelling. And there's one other sort of advertisement, so I always want to show in. They're having a couple popular popular culture references here. Let me see if I can share this other one with you here. Oh, I can't get this other one. Oh, here it is. This is just another view. This is the DVD warning. The monster demands a mate. Boris Karloff, as it says here, the Bride of Frankenstein. So same sort of idea. And here you have again that traditional Frankenstein's monster with the square head. Looks like you can see where he opened the top to put the brains in, the things to attach the electrodes on the side, the square head, the whole bit there with that one. So I hope you found this second lecture helpful. And this brings us up to the last part of the book, and you're going to be doing the discussion questions for the last part of the book. I know you have some time off on Wednesday, so enjoy any free time that you can find on Wednesday from your classes, and get the book finished on Friday. Upload the discussion questions, and as I always do, I will upload some responses to the discussion questions for you to think about. So I hope you found that helpful. Enjoy the rest of your week.